Hi everyone, and welcome to our video which is on stereotypes and regional language. Now this video today is going to be split into two parts. In the first part of our video, we'll be examining the idea of stereotypes, and particularly Australian stereotypes. In the second part of our video, we'll be looking at the concept of regional language and some real examples in Australian literature. And by bringing these two parts together, you can really start to develop an understanding of the Australian image and the Australian voice. So if we just look at a plan for today's lesson, firstly we'll be looking at understanding stereotypes. Secondly, we'll be looking at some common Australian stereotypes and personalities. And lastly, we'll be looking at the idea of voice in Australian literature, so idioms and vernacular, how Australian stereotypes are expressed through literature. So let's start by asking ourselves, what is a stereotype? Now, a stereotype is a formulaic group of ideas that we have about different people. So we might be thinking about specific assumptions related to people's ethnicity, or their gender, their jobs and occupations, their religion. It's also really important to remember though, that even though these stereotypes exist and they're often quite prominent in our society, they do not necessarily reflect reality. Instead, that they're judgments we make without knowing the facts. So a lot of what's going to be in this video today is just informing you about the stereotypes that do exist. What I'm not necessarily doing is telling you that this is Australian society. It's just what Australian society is often thought to be. So that distinction is really important to remember. Now let's take a look at linking stereotypes to English. Remember, it's really important to understand Australian stereotypes and regional language in order to help your language study. Because part of that language is really understanding the different layers that make up how language is constructed and how that contributes to Australian voice. Your focus on this unit is also going to be Australian texts and related material. So having a background about, the Australian culture and typical Australian stereotypes is going to be really useful for you. This background information is vital to set up the foundations of your understanding. So we're going to be looking at quite a lot of information today, but information which is going to be really useful for you. So let's look at some common Australian stereotypes. Now, Australian stereotypes have developed to show that Australians are relaxed and easygoing people. Stereotypes are the sort of things that you see in movies, in books, on, TV shows. It's the image which, every Australian is given, but it's not necessarily true. So, if you're thinking Australian stereotypes, you're thinking everyone rides to school on a kangaroo, everyone lives in the desert or out in the bush, Sydney Harbour, drinking beer, throwing another shrimp on the barbie, and beaches. So all of these things that kind of make up this stereotypical view of Australia. And sure, we do have these things in Australia, but it's not necessarily all that we stand for. So let's take a look at where this sort of Australian voice and stereotype originated from. A really important thing to look at is the Anzac legend. Now, the Anzac legend was an important sort of theme or concept that came out of one of the most important events in Australian history. And that was during World War I as part of the Gallipoli campaign. And this basically involved the Australian diggers, who were the soldiers, fighting against the Turkish soldiers at Gallipoli, which is a stretch of land in Turkey. Australian pride in this event is called the Anzac legend. Basically the idea that Australians fought incredibly hard against the odds, and also in the midst of this they were brave, they were funny, they were cheerful, resourceful, light-hearted. So that really Australian idea. We can also take a look at the Eureka Stockade. Now, the Eureka Stockade is another area of the Australian origin of identity. Basically where, during the gold rush, the miners who lived in this country at the time stood up against the oppressive government policies. So, they weren't going to be oppressed anymore and they decided to do something about it. Although the miners failed, this event symbolised the Australian idea of the fair go, democracy and rebellion against authority. So we're really getting that sense that the Australian identity is growing out of actual historical events, and these early themes can then be traced throughout the Australian voice in history, and we'll take a look at that a bit further in this video when we look at the idea of voice and language. So, stereotypical visions of Australia. You know, the picture of Vegemite here is just one example of those sort of images that stand out as being the things that define Australia. But we know that that isn't necessarily true. Typical personalities associated with Australia are known both in Australia and more widely around the world. And we're going to be now examining some of the qualities of each of these groups. Keep in mind that these aren't necessarily true or representative of society in reality. What they are is the stereotypical images, which you're going to be seeing a lot because they're very commonly represented. So firstly, let's take a look at the concept of the Aussie bloke. Now, the Aussie bloke is the first sort of character, as you will, of Australian literature. The Aussie bloke wears thongs, a singlet, and an open flannel shirt, so, you can picture him. He might work in a physical job, such as bricklaying. He probably has a mullet hairdo. He speaks with an ochre accent, so saying things like, g'day mate, all that sort of language. He drinks beer and eats a lot of red meat. He loves sports such as footy and cricket. So, these sort of layers of the image that are being built up to build that really stereotypical Australian man. We then get to the Aussie Sheila, which is another name for the Aussie woman. Now, the Australian woman stereotypically gossips a lot, supports the local footy club, so again we're seeing that footy obsession coming through, works in the school canteen, drinks and smokes heavily, has a nasal voice and swears a lot, is tough and can even get into fist fights, so can be quite violent. We then get to the image of the bushman. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of, characters like Steve Irwin, those sort of quintessential Australian bushmen who would go out into the wilderness and fight against the elements. And that's obviously something that has an origin in the early days of Australian settlement, and we'll look at that a little bit later. The bushman lives and works in the outback or the bush. He's very tough, so he can handle livestock. He rides horses with ease and herds cattle. He's not afraid of snakes or crocodiles. He knows bush law and the local Aboriginals. He also speaks in a very broad country accent, so again we're getting that sense of dialect really coming through. The next stereotype in Australian culture is the idea of the little battler. Now, the little battler is a family man, woman, or child who has some sort of disadvantage in society. So perhaps is a working class poor person or is suffering under extremely heavy conditions such as an illness. However, in spite of all of these barriers against them, they're incredibly optimistic and they work extremely hard to better their situation. They're stoic and they never complain. They also get some limited success in the end. Next is the concept of the Aussie family. Now, this is something that you might be familiar with, probably while you're at school and living with your own families. But the stereotypical Australian family isn't necessarily reality, remember. So, the middle-class wife looks after the kids, cooks, and maybe has a part-time job. The family takes pride in their house renovations, backyards, and are currently paying off their mortgage. The husband has an alright job and loves watching the football with his mates on the weekend. So that picture of the sort of very small nuclear family with their house in the suburbs, with their backyard, their pet dog, all those sort of images come to mind. We then get the Australian businessman. So the Australian businessman, as a stereotype, is a sweaty, bald and fat man who wears suits that doesn't fit. So maybe you have seen someone a bit like this on the train or something. He knows everyone in town. He trades in his wife for a younger one, so he's a bit of a player maybe. He's corrupt and power hungry. So he's sort of the quintessential image of the search for power in society and the way that sort of money and work can get you to a position of power. He likes to show off his money and power. So this might be through material objects like flashy sports cars or buying expensive jewelry for his wife. We then get to the stereotype of the pushy mum. Now, the pushy mum is ambitious and pushes her kid who doesn't really want to be involved. So the kid doesn't actually want to do it and the mum is making them. She probably smokes and swears in private, but out in public she wears cardigans, pearls, and too much makeup. We then get to the idea of the Aussie larrikin. Now, the larrikin is the funny guy, so he's always making jokes and doesn't take anything too seriously. He's pretty relaxed about life. He could possibly be into drugs or surfing and probably isn't very smart. He's annoying sometimes, but fairly likable and quickly forgiven for the trouble that he causes. The next stereotype is the idea of the buffhead. Now, the buffhead is a big, tough guy who isn't very smart. So remember again, these are the stereotypes. He can be possibly on a football team or in some sort of gang. He's usually under the direction of one of his smarter mates. Another stereotype we can take a look at is the weedy guy. Now, the weedy guy is a man who is not very blokey. So he doesn't fit with that typical Aussie man we looked at earlier who loves sport and beer and, hanging out with his mates. Instead, the weedy guy is a little bit different. He's uninterested in sport and he's probably pushed around by his wife. He also has a very quiet personality, so he's not that outspoken, loud voice man that we saw earlier. He might wear glasses, for example. He's disrespected by men and women who believe that he should try harder to be masculine, so, being forced into liking sport, things like that. Another stereotype is the idea of the crooked official. Now, this does go back to those earlier idea of the Eureka Stockade, which we looked at, where the miners rose up against the really unfair policemen and government. So the crooked official is a man who has the job at the top, is corrupt for his own benefit, or due to peer pressure of others. He might be a politician, a policeman, or some other leader in the town. And, through bribery and corruption, he can get wherever he wants to be. The final image, which we'll take a look at, is the idea of the lifesaver. Now, the lifesaver is the typical image of the Australian beach lifestyle. He's a strong, handsome young man who's very tanned from all the time he spends on the beach and wears his typical Speedos, or as they're called, budgie smugglers. He's brave and fearless, risking his life to help others. And he enjoys things like sports, fitness, and being outdoors. So this again is another really stereotypical image, but again one that is present in Australia, but perhaps isn't necessarily of a cross-section, rather just a couple of individuals. So this brings us to the end of part 1 of our 2-part video. In this video, we've taken a look at some of those Australian stereotypes, and in part 2, if you join us in just a moment, we'll be applying these to Australian regional language.